Well, good morning again. Great to see you guys. Thanks for being here in the room, braving the rain and coming out this morning. Or if you're sitting at home, we're thankful you're there too, connecting with us. Or if you're watching this later, we're glad that you're connecting with us that way as well. Pastor Andrew was up here before, and I'm Pastor Corey, and we're excited that you're with us. Whether you'll just be able to sing together, to be able to learn together, it's awesome to just be able to be the church together. We started a sermon series last week called I've Got Questions, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more today. But the reason we're even having this conversation is I've kind of experienced in my own life, I've experienced this as I've engaged with other people who are followers of Jesus or kind of investigating followers of Jesus or what it means to follow Jesus, is there are certain questions that just seem to come up. There are certain questions that kind of circle around. And even if you've been a follower of Jesus for years, decades, however long, there's still those moments where you kind of maybe wake up one morning and go, can I really believe this? Is this really true? Is this something that I can base my life on or make decisions about? Or is this really okay that this is where I am and what I believe? And so last week we had a conversation about doubt. And I know in church world, doubt can be something that in certain circles, it can kind of be like, just don't, right? Don't ask those questions. Don't think about it that way. Don't doubt those things. And I would actually say, I would want you to go the opposite direction. I would say lean into those things in a healthy way. Ask questions, do research, talk to people around you that are also followers of Jesus, and how do we engage with this? And so if that conversation, if you missed that, you weren't here last week, or you didn't watch last week, go back and it will be there for you. I would encourage you to have that conversation. We're going to talk about something a little bit different today. But before we dive in completely, I want to remind us of a concept that I talked about last week, and I think this is important for the way we as followers of Jesus today kind of understand this. And I think that this will help us understand why these things maybe come up a little bit more often than they have in the past. And that concept was this. It was ground war versus air war. I'm not talking about an actual war, but it's kind of just an analogy of this. When we get to engage in learning like we are right now, that whether it's in church or it's in a school or something like that, we would call that ground war. We would say, hey, we're learning face to face. We're having a conversation. You have some concept of like who I am. I know many of you. And so there's a personal connection that's happening. And we would think about learning that way as ground war. But then there's this other thing that happens, and I would call that air war. By the way, this isn't original to me. I've heard multiple pastors kind of talk about this. And the idea behind this is we all kind of live at least some way online. And when we go online or whether we turn on a TV or anything like that, there are people we don't know. We don't have their credentials. We don't know why we would listen to their opinion, but they drop their opinion in our lap, whether we're scrolling through social, you're flipping channels on TV, whatever it might be. And now all of a sudden we have to decide what we do with that opinion or that stance and how we process it in that moment. You opened your phone, you didn't know that person was going to communicate with you, and yet they did. And so sometimes that can just jack up your day. Like you're just scrolling, and then someone's like, can you really believe God? And then they lay out all these things, and then you're like, I don't know. Like all of a sudden now you're thinking about this, and what do I do with it? And so a big part of this conversation is just saying, how do we, in those moments particularly, how do we engage well with Scripture and say, how do we handle this kind of challenge, this tweaking of our heart? How do we handle that in a way that's God-honoring, and how do we do it in a way where faith doesn't become this frazzled thing, but we can kind of get our bearings and understand what Scripture really teaches and what we really believe? Today we're going to talk about something, and I don't say this lightly, I'm not saying it hyperbolically, but it may be the greatest challenge to Christianity. What we're going to talk about today is probably the greatest challenge to Christianity. And what do I mean by that? I don't mean that it necessarily means that Christianity wouldn't be true, but it's one of those questions that kind of exists within Christianity, within the world, that there's actually not just a clean answer for. Like if we're going to talk about why we believe Jesus walked out of the grave, I can give you a ton of reasons why we believe that historically the honest truth is that tomb was empty and that he walked out of it. I can point to many different things historically. But this challenge today and this question that will come up in your life, it'll come up in my life, it'll come up probably in everyone's life, whether they're a follower of Jesus or not, is one of the greatest challenges because there's not a clean answer. I can't do 2 + 2 = 4 for you. I can't just put something around it and just say, and this is why we know and all this stuff. And I will build an argument today and we'll have a conversation from a biblical perspective that helps us understand, but it's not necessarily going to be a clean answer. And so I would say today, just understand, you may not walk out of here with all your questions answered, But I think if we lean into Scripture, we can understand from a good perspective, a good biblical perspective, at least how to engage in this topic a little bit better. And the topic we're going to talk about today is known as the problem of evil. You know, it's interesting when you look around culture, from a very young age, and then many people all the way up to however old you are, right? There's this fascination when it comes to storytelling, whether it's books, it's movies, it's TV shows, about identifying the good guy and the bad guy, right? And so you look at it and you figure out who the hero is, who's the person we're supposed to root for, who's the person that we're supposed to be excited about, who's the person standing for justice, and then there's usually someone or some entity or something else, and they're the bad guy. And maybe you've even been in situations where it's like a theater setting, and like someone comes out that's the bad guy, and people actually boo the bad guy, right? And they cheer the good guy, and all that kind of stuff. And it's interesting that this becomes such a deep part of storytelling. And from a very early age, we identify with this. We understand, we look at those things, and like my boys always wanted to dress up as like Captain America and Spider-Man and all of that kind of stuff. And like if they want to dress up as Darth Vader, it's a little bit like, what's wrong with you, right? Why are we dressing up like the bat? No, I'm just kidding, that's not true. But we think about it, it's like, it's interesting that we kind of process that. And I wonder why is it that in our culture, whether people are followers of Jesus or not, we kind of gravitate towards this idea of identifying what's good and what's evil. And when you get into a deeper conversation, not around comic books or TV shows or movies, we get into more conversation about that. And it gets really deep as to what is good and what is bad, and how do we kind of sift that out, and how do we understand those things. And then when you introduce the topic of God or the person of God into the equation, then it leads to this natural question. And that question would be, if God is good, why do bad things happen? And people will look at Christians, they will look at Christianity as a whole and say, okay, so you believe in this all good, all powerful, holy God, and yet there's kids in Africa who need food and they won't get it. So how does that work? Why is it that he could change everything? He could step in and just say, it's not happening anymore. Like this, we'll just fix it and it'll just be done. And yet there are still people that suffer. And why is that? And honestly, if you've ever asked that question, it's a good question. It's an honest question. And for people that engage with Christianity but won't take that step into Christianity, it's a good question. They wrestle with it. And so what do we do about this? I'm going to talk through 3 questions today as we process this. The first question is, does the presence of evil disprove the presence of God? So think about it this way. Does the fact that evil exists mean that a good and perfect and holy God does not exist? We'll talk about that in a little bit. Are pain and suffering actually worthless? Are they not worth going through? Are they absolutely always a net negative to our experience? And why do we take pain, suffering, and evil so personally? And so where we're going to go today to do this, we're actually going to go to the story of Joseph, which we're going to start in Genesis 37. If you want today, you can follow along with us on your phone or on your tablet. You can scan that QR code, take it to our follow along. We're not going to jump around as much as last week. So last week I was all over the place. We're going to work our way through a story this time. So it's not going to be jumping around scripture as much. But everything will be up on the screen too. But if you want to follow along there and get some notes there, you can do that as well. All right, so question 1, before we jump to the scriptures, does the presence of evil disprove the presence of God? Now, we're going to pick up the story in Genesis 37, verse 2. So here's kind of the setting, and then I'll give you a little bit more a background in a moment. It says, this is the account of Jacob and his family. When Joseph was 17 years old, he often tended his father's flocks. He worked for his half-brothers, the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. But Joseph reported to his father some of the bad things his brothers were doing. Okay, so just give you kind of the lay of the land, right? You can already tell this sibling relationship is not going well, right? If you are the younger brother and you have older brothers and you went and told on your older brothers, that was not going to go well for you. And if you were the older brother like me and your younger brother was tattling on you, that was not great either, okay? So we're already in a situation where we're going, the tension in this relationship is already present. Joseph's working for his half-brothers, but he's reporting back to dad all the things the half-brothers are doing that are not good, okay? It gets worse. Going on to verses 3 and 4. It says, Jacob loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph had been born to him in his old age. So one day, Jacob had a special gift made for Joseph, a beautiful robe. But his brothers hated Joseph because their father loved him more than the rest of them. They couldn't say a kind word about him. Okay, so if you're a parent, you're not supposed to have a favorite child, right? And if you do, you're not supposed to let the other ones know, okay? But that's not the situation here. They all knew Dad loved Joseph more than them. He would listen to Joseph more. He got special gifts more for Joseph than he did for them. There was a lot of tension already in this relationship. We're not going to read this part, but it gets worse because Joseph starts to have dreams where he is in charge and his brothers are bowing down to him. And guess what he does? He runs to his brothers and says, guys, guess what I dreamed last night? And they're like, we are done with you, right? If you have that kind of dream, don't tell your siblings. So they start to make a plan as to what they're going to do to Joseph to rid themselves of this annoying little brother. And so we're going to skip down to verses 23 to 25 of still Genesis 37. It says, so when Joseph arrived, his brothers ripped off his beautiful robe he was wearing. Then they grabbed him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty. There was no water in it. Then just as they were sitting down to eat, they looked up and saw a caravan of camels in the distance coming towards them. It was a group of Ishmaelite traders taking a load of gum, balm, and aromatic resin from Gilead down to Egypt. So again, I'll give you a little bit more of the context we're not going to read here, but they were thinking they were actually going to kill Joseph. They were just going to get rid of him. And one of the brothers speaks up and he goes, hey, let's not actually kill him. Let's just sell him into slavery. Let's just do that. We'll sell him to these guys. They'll take care of him, and we won't have to worry about him anymore, and we won't have actually killed him. And so they do that. They sell him to these traders as they're coming by, and they take his robe, and they get animal's blood, and they make it look like he was killed, and they take the robe to Dad, and they say, look what happened to your son Joseph. Isn't this so sad? Right? And they move on with life as though Joseph was no longer around. Moving forward to chapter 39, here's what happens kind of over and over again for Joseph. He gets introduced into these settings where he then works his way up the food chain. Like he kind of comes in at the ground level and he works his way up. He gets promoted and promoted and promoted. Things were not going well when he was at home with his brothers, but then when he gets into other situations, he sees favorable things happen. And so he gets taken to Egypt, just with the Ishmaelite traders, just as it said, and he ends up in a guy's house named Potiphar. And he was Potiphar's servant, but he works his way up to be the highest servant in Potiphar's house. And so this is a good thing for him until Potiphar's wife takes notice of Joseph in an inappropriate way. And so she makes a move on Joseph, but Joseph says, no, I'm not doing that. And he actually runs out of the house. Well, Potiphar's wife tells a lie and says that's not the way it went. And this is Potiphar's response in Genesis 39, verses 19 to 21. It says, Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story about how Joseph had treated her. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held. And here he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him his faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. So let's just think about Joseph's life kind of so far, right? He wasn't the best younger brother, okay? We'll say that. But did he deserve to be thrown into and sold into slavery? Well, obviously not. And then he does what's right when Potiphar's wife comes after him, and instead she tells a lie, and so he ends up in prison because he did what was right. But again, at the end of this, he ends up in prison, and what does it say? It says that he was one of the favorites of the prison warden. He starts, even in prison, they recognize who he is, and he starts to kind of work his way up in favor with those who are in charge. Now fast forward to Genesis 40. Joseph is still in prison, okay? So he's not out of prison yet. He meets a couple of guys when they're there. One of the guys that he meets is the king's cupbearer. And the cupbearer has a dream, and Joseph can interpret dreams. And so the dream is told to Joseph. And this is what Joseph says in Genesis 40, verses 12 through 15. It says, this is what the dream means, Joseph said. The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it. So he does his buddy a favor. What's my dream? He tells him. He says, this is going to go well for you. Just a few days, you're going to get your spot back. He goes, when you get your spot back and you get to Pharaoh, tell him I'm here. Tell him I don't deserve to be here. See if you can get me out of here. So, okay, that's great. Let's see if that plays out. In chapter 40, verses 20 to 21, and then we'll read 23. It says, Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and his chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But then it says Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. You'd think you'd remember the guy who told you a dream that you would get your spot back, and then when you get your spot back, you'd actually remember it just 3 days later, right? He thinks no more about Joseph and forgets all about him. So Joseph is sold into slavery for being a bad younger brother. He's thrown in jail for doing what's right and running away from Potiphar's wife. And then he stays in jail because his buddy that he did a favor for forgets all about him. Now here's the thing, whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, you can see that Joseph's life is not going well. And it is not fair what has happened to Joseph. You see, it's easy for us to point out injustices when we see them. It's easy for people to look at certain situations and say, what happened there? That's not right. That's not okay. If there was a judge who had somebody come before them and they had taken somebody else's life and they said, we're going to put you in jail for 20 to 30 years, we'd all kind of go, you know what, you took somebody else's life. That's kind of the way it goes. But if a judge sat on the stand and had somebody come before him, it was proven that they took somebody else's life, he said, you know, I'm in a good mood today. I think I'm going to let you go. We would all go, that's not right. We understand that, right? We can look at this story. We could say that we recognize this is wrong. By the way, we don't have to be very old or we don't have to be very wise to understand this. These next couple of phrases, the first two, not the last one, but the first one especially, I have heard come out of my children's mouths many, many times. It's a simple phrase. It's that's not fair. And no matter how old you are, you think this at times, right? It's they got to sit up front and I didn't, right? It's they got the first piece of cake or they got the flour on the cake that I wanted and I wanted to get it and this, whatever. They got to open the present first. They got to whatever. And maybe if you're an adult, right, and you're a little more mature than that, it's they got to merge before I did. They got to get the promotion before I did. We know this. We can look at many situations in life and we can say that's not fair. We can also say that's not right. It's not right that that happened. It's not right that that happened to that person. It's not okay that this happened. There's plenty of situations where we can process this. And then if you add God into the equation, we could ask the question, how could God allow that? If we know and understand who God is, or we would say we worship the God of the universe, how could he allow that to happen? What I'm seeing happen, what I'm experiencing happen. I look at that person and what's going on in their life. How could that be the thing that he allows to happen in their life? And what I want us to understand, like I talked about earlier with our fascination with the good guy and the bad guy and what's right, what's wrong, that says something about who we are and who we were created to be. It says something that we would look at the world around us and we would point out things and we would say, that's not okay, or that's not fair, or why was that allowed? And the way I want us to understand it is this, is that evil cannot be evil without the existence of good. In fact, I would explain it this way. If you grew up in an environment or you experienced an environment where it was just dark all the time, just dark, like there was no light or there was very little light and that just was the reality. It was always that way. The moment that light was introduced, it would change everything for you. But if you only went through life experiencing the darkness, you would never know the existence of light. And I would argue that we recognize and understand, whether we are God-fearing people or not, we recognize and understand that something's not right. But it doesn't make complete sense, because if there is no good, if there is no ultimate good, if there is no God to fix it, then why do we recognize it as bad anyway? Another way of saying this, and this is, you might have to take another sip of coffee to really wrap your head around this one, so I'll just give you that warning. This is how I would say it. When what is natural seems unnatural, it is because of something supernatural. I'll read it again, right? Lock in for a second. What is natural seems unnatural. It's because of something supernatural. Here's what I mean by that. I'll give you a different example. When we look at the world around us, we know that tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, tsunami, those are all things that just kind of happen in our world. Now, if we're followers of Jesus, we understand that that's a result of sin. But if you remove that from the equation just for a second, we just know that's going to happen, right? Hurricane season's going to come. There's probably going to be a hurricane somewhere. And when those hurricanes are particularly terrible, we look at the devastation brought on by that hurricane, and it might break our heart. We look at people that lost their homes. We look at people that lost their lives in a storm that happened that they had no control over. But if we look at that, we remove God from the equation. We just go, that's just the way the natural world is. Then why does it break our heart when someone loses their home or loses their life if it was just part of the natural world? In fact, and I don't mean this, but I would say, why wouldn't we just say to that person, you shouldn't live there, move to where there's no hurricanes. Go somewhere where that's not going to happen to you maybe. But instead we see that devastation, we go, actually, maybe we should help. Maybe we should raise money. Maybe we should send a team. Maybe we should go help those people because they're devastated. We want to make right what was made wrong. Because we're drawn to something deeper than just saying this naturally happens in the world around us and we're just fine with it. And it's because there's a supernatural understanding built into each of us that says this is not the way it's supposed to be. In fact, when we look at those three things, it's not fair, this isn't right, how could God allow this? It's because we understand, whether we know Jesus or not, that it's not the way it's supposed to be. And when we recognize evil for what it is, it's because we also know what good is, and it's because we understand what God has created it to be. And so if we go back to that original question, does the presence of evil disprove the presence of God? I would say this, that the fact that we recognize evil, suffering, and those kinds of things as bad, as negative, as not good, actually points to us also understanding that there is the existence of God we can rely on, and it points us to him rather than seeing that the two can't coexist, because we see something's wrong. And so we have to dig a little deeper and say, so what is wrong? Why does this matter so much? Question 2 was this: are pain and suffering worthless? We're going to stay with the story of Joseph, but we're going to fast forward some chapters. So we're going to get to Genesis 45. By the way, things have changed drastically for Joseph. He does get out of prison, so that's good, right? And he gets into the service of the Pharaoh. And guess what? He works his way up again. He makes his way to the top, and he gets put in charge of basically the nation of Egypt. Like he's now got all this responsibility. And he had a dream, and the dream was about the fact that there was going to be a famine. And so Joseph says, we need to prepare for this famine. It was going to be a 7-year famine. And so he starts to do the work to make sure that they're all taken care of. And guess who comes knocking on the door looking for food? It's his brothers. And so in Genesis 45, verses 3 through 5, this is what it says. He says, I am Joseph. It says, I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, I'm Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Pause. Think about that. Joseph's brothers come knocking on the door, and Joseph's the one with all the food. By the way, at this point, the famine had been 2 years long. It wasn't a couple months, and they're like, oh no, like they're in dire need of food, and Joseph has all the control. He messes with them a little bit later, as any good brother would do. But look at what he says at the end. He goes, don't be mad at yourselves for selling me into slavery. If your sibling sold you into slavery, what would it take for you to say that? He says, don't be mad at yourselves. And then he says, it was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. He goes, you dummies, you sold me into slavery so I could save you, right? It changes the perspective completely. And then if we go just a little further in verses 6 through 8, it says, this famine, this is still Joseph talking, that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. and he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace, and the governor of all Egypt. Remember those dreams I told you about that Joseph had? They came true. His brothers are now before him, and he's in charge. But Joseph's perspective on what God is doing is incredible. He says, it was God who sent me here, not you. He goes, you sold me, but it was all part of God's plan. Think about the perspective you have to understand that. This is a perspective I think we all know and understand, whether we're followers of Jesus or not, that we get this. That pain and suffering often bring strength and growth. They often do. You think about anything that you would want to accomplish in life, it's going to come at a cost. It's going to take you saying, I'm going to deny myself of one thing in order to make sure I do the other thing. If you want to run a marathon, you're going to have to start running somewhere. You're going to run a third of a mile, and you're going to say, I can't run at all anymore, right? That's what I would do. And then you just keep working your way up. And all of a sudden, one day, you're able to run the 26 miles. If you're going to lose weight, at some point, you're going to say, I'm not going to eat these things. I'm going to work out instead. And you're going to lose 1 pound. And you're going to go, is this even worth it? And then you're going to lose 10, and you're going to lose 20, and you're going to lose 30, you're going to lose more. And you're going to go, this is awesome. And all of this is because you've taken something that you said, I want to do, something that you thought was worth it, and you said, I'm going to push myself. I'm going to grow. I'm going to put myself through something. I'm not just going to choose the easy thing. I'm going to actually do something difficult. You put anything else in that equation, weightlifting, working your way through school, all of those things take strength and growth. You're going to have to go through pain and suffering to get strength and growth. You're going to have to go through pain. It's going to be difficult. You're going to have to study hard. You're going to have to work hard, whatever. You're going to have to suffer through it. There's going to be times when you go, I don't want to do this. And yet you're going to have to say, I'm going to do this. And what happens? You see the strength and the growth. What happens if we don't do those things? What happens if we don't? What happens if we say, I'm just going to live life with all the things I want to do? And I'm just going to be comfortable. And I'm just going to, then we get weak, and we get the opposite of that. We don't want to be in that place. And here's what I know. Ready? Let's just be honest with ourselves. You and I will suffer to get something we want. I've probably told this story before. I think I did. I'll tell it in a shorter way. When I was in college, the Chick-fil-A in Downingtown was opening in January. And if you camped out overnight in the parking lot, you got 52 free meal coupons on the morning it opened, okay? So guess what me and my friends did? We took a tent and we slept in a parking lot in January because 52 free meal coupons to Chick-fil-A is $1 million when you're in college, okay? So we did it. It was cold. It was fun because our friends were there. The ground was hard, but we woke up the next morning and we got those free meal coupons. If you said to me, let's go sleep in a parking lot in January now, I'd say, you're nuts, right? I am not doing that again. But I did it. Why? Because I wanted something. We will suffer if we want something. We will. If we want to save up for the whatever the vacation is or whatever, we'll say no to the McDonald's today a bunch of times so we can save up for that. If we want something, we will suffer for it. We will make the choices. If you don't want it, you won't do it. But if we want it, we will suffer for it. Here's the question I think this all comes down to. Do we want what God wants for us or not? Do we actually want what God wants for us? And I get that the challenge to this is, Pastor Corey, but it's not fair that God just sits up there and says, you're going to suffer, and that's the way we grow. That may not be fair. And I would say, well, just hit time out on this. What happens when you play a sport and your coach makes you run a bunch of laps? Or he makes you run up hills? Or they make you do a bunch of push-ups? Make you do a bunch of sit-ups? You may never do a push-up, a sit-up, or run up a hill in the sport you play. And they make you suffer for that little bit of time. Why? So that you can be better later. Listen, this is one of these things where I don't understand it. Why is it this way, Pastor Corey? I don't know, but this is the way God created the world to work. That when we go through difficult times and we push ourselves through and we engage in it, and when it's hard to do, when it's physically hard to do, our bodies grow. When it's mentally hard to do, our minds, we get smarter, right? That's the way it is. And so when we lean into that and we engage that way, we don't look at those coaches that pushed us and say they're terrible for wanting more out of us. We don't look at our parents when they challenge us and say, we're going to make you save up money for this purchase. We're not just going to give you the money. We're going to teach you how to manage this, or we're going to let you fall off the bike a couple times so that you actually learn how to ride the bike in real life. We don't look at those parents and say, those are terrible parents making their kids suffer like that, right? We say, no, that's good that we make mistakes and we learn from it. Do we want the same thing from God? And when those difficult things get introduced into our lives, do we engage with them the same way and say, God's trying to do something through me? Now, here's what I will say. I think the problem of evil would actually have real teeth to it and cause real challenges if this next part that I'm going to share with you wasn't true. We're going to jump just for a minute to Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, just verses 9 and 10. This is what it says. What we do see is Jesus, who for a little while was given a position a little lower than the angels. And because he suffered death for us, he is now crowned with glory and honor. Yes, by God's grace, Jesus tasted death for everyone. God, for whom and through whom everything was made, chose to bring many children into glory, and it was only right that he should make Jesus, through his suffering, a perfect leader, fit to bring them into their salvation. I would say if we had the argument to say God doesn't engage in our suffering with us, then Christianity would have a problem. It would be a big challenge. But here's the thing that sets Christianity apart from every other religion. Every other religion looks at us and says, suffer your way out of that hole and get to God. Christianity says Jesus came into that hole to suffer with you and carries you out of that pit. And that's the difference. That when we look at our God, he's not just sitting up there just saying, good luck, figure it out. Here's another hill sprint, go for it. No, he goes, he came down and did it all. He came down as an infant, which is bonkers, lived through an entire life, all the way through death. So even in our death, when we are on our deathbed, we will know that Jesus walked through that exact same door. The God we worshiped walked through every ounce of suffering that we will ever endure. We are not by ourselves. It is not something that is foreign to him. And in fact, through his suffering, we are welcomed into a relationship with him. I would just say it this way, that Jesus thought you were worth suffering for. You don't suffer for nothing. Life isn't challenging for nothing. Jesus came down and said, this challenge, this suffering, this pain is worth it. He says, you were worth it. Question 3. So why do we take pain, suffering, and evil so personally? I've often thought it was very interesting because even people who are not followers of Jesus have a real problem with a good God who allows bad things to happen. It gets real personal for them. They go, I can't ever believe in a God like that. And in the back of my mind, I go, well, you don't believe in God at all, so why does it affect you so personally? And I know the answer to that question, but I don't think they know the answer to that question. But I would say the reason is this, because we know pain, suffering, and evil are a result of a broken relationship. If you've ever had a broken relationship, like you've gone through a breakup or maybe even a divorce, or maybe the relationship with your parents isn't what you wish it would be, or you've got a sibling that's estranged, or whatever it might be. There's a relationship that you've had that was good at one point, and then it was broken. I think many of these things would be included in that process. There was probably pain in that. Somebody said something, somebody did something that caused pain, and then there's a rift, and then it's broken, and it's painful. There's a broken relationship there. There's suffering there. There's moments where you wish they were there at Christmas, or you could just pick up the phone and call them, but you know they're not going to respond the same way, and so that causes some suffering inside of you. And maybe even there's evil. In fact, most broken relationships I've seen involve some sort of sin. Something there that happened that was not just a misunderstanding. It wasn't just a miscommunication. There was a moral failure, whichever way, or both. And we know when these things happen, we recognize a broken relationship. Listen to me. When we say we can't believe in a good God because there's evil, here's what we're calling ourselves back to, and we don't even know it. We're calling ourselves back to the Garden of Eden, the way God actually set it up to be. Because everything was perfect there. We lived in perfect relationship with God. Adam and Eve had perfect relationship with God. They could walk with him. They could talk with him. They hung out with him. It was great. And then what happened? Sin entered the world. So the way God laid it out, he goes, this is where we're supposed to be. This is how it's supposed to work out. And then sin enters the world, and we recognize pain and suffering and evil because there's a broken relationship. And I would say every time a person takes it personally that there is evil in the world, and the idea of a good God makes them frustrated because they know the relationship is broken. They can't communicate it, but they recognize that our relationship with God is not where it should be. Back to Joseph for a minute. Genesis 50, verses 19 to 21. This is the key to the entire story of Joseph. It says, "But Joseph replied, 'Don't be afraid of me. Am I God that I can punish you?'" Now listen to me. Joseph has a great perspective here. In all of this is where it's difficult. But he says, "Am I God that I can punish you?" Here's what Joseph is really recognizing. We can't understand everything God understands. That's why this conversation, I said, we're not going to walk out of here with perfect answers, because there's some parts of this where we just kind of have to go, I'm not God. I can't have all the answers. He has to have all the answers. And so Joseph even says it. He goes, I can't be the one who does all of it. I am not God. I'm going to leave that up to him. But he says this, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people. No, don't be afraid. I will continue to take care of you and your children." So he reassured them by speaking kindly to them. He says, what you did to me, you thought you were doing for evil. You thought it was going to be all bad stuff. He says, but God didn't have that plan. It was a different plan. And this is what I think is true, that the relationship with God turns suffering from an obstacle into an opportunity. We will avoid any suffering. Now, this is me too. I'm just saying that we will avoid any sort of suffering or uncomfortability with like the plague, right? Here's what we had to decide this week. You guys had a fight in your house, whether you were turning on the air conditioning or not this week, didn't you? Or some of you were like, no, I just didn't do it, right? It was like one of those things. We had the conversation. It's getting warm in here. We turn on the air conditioning and we're like, no, we saved money. We're all good, right? Because now it's cold outside again. Anyway, but we had to have that conversation because it started to get a little warm, and whether it's window units or the central air, whatever it is, right? Are we going to do it or are we not? Are we going to put up with a little bit of heat or are we not? What are we going to do? Because we know it's there. And that's a very low-level thing, right? But there are other situations in life where we will go, I'm just not going to do it. I don't want to go through the suffering. I don't want to go through the frustration. I don't want to go through it. But here's what I know. There are moments where we can't avoid it. You can't just avoid the diagnosis. You can't just avoid the difficult conversation. You can't just avoid what's going on and say we're just not going to deal with it and just pretend we're going to sweep it under the rug because it's going to come back. So what do we do in those moments? I think when we know God, it turns from an obstacle, from something we just have to get through or get around or get over or get past, and it turns into an opportunity for things to change. If we look at the story of Joseph, it is so clear. Joseph says all these bad things. He goes, it was actually God in the midst of it. God was doing something with it. And now we see on the other side, and here's what I will say, and I'll qualify it with one thing at the end. I have never seen somebody that goes through suffering and leans in and uses it as an opportunity to grow the kingdom of God, to share Jesus with other people. I have never seen that come back void. Now, do they always get healed and are they always fine? No, they end up in heaven, and that's the qualifier, is even when we walk through death as followers of Jesus, guess what the end result is? We end up with Jesus. It's not over at the end. Listen, I just go back to it, and I'm not dunking on anybody, I'm not saying, but like, if you don't believe that there's a God and just at the end of life the lights go out, then all the suffering is for nothing. And I think, as followers of Jesus, when we get to heaven one day, we're going to put together some of these stories. It's really nice that Joseph kind of had a bow put on his story. And God brought his brothers back, and he got to see how God used him in his brothers' lives. I think heaven's going to be a lot of that. That somebody's going to look at something you did or something you said and you have no idea how God used it in their life, and you're going to get to heaven one day and they're going to go, your suffering or your story or your difficulty or your whatever, God used it in incredible ways in my life. We may not get all those bows tied on here, but we may get them in heaven. Question is, do we use it? Look at it as an obstacle or an opportunity. These three things I know to be true. We know injustice produces pain. Whenever there's injustice, whenever things aren't right, whenever things aren't fair, it produces pain. But here's what I also know. Pain is evidence something is wrong. Have you ever thought of pain as a gift? It's a gift that we have the ability to feel pain. It's a gift that when you put your hand down on the burner, you realize it's hot and you take it off, right? It's a gift when you understand that. One of the things, I won't go too long into this, one of the things I've talked about in the past is, Jesus created us. He knows every bit of who we are, how our pain systems work, and all that. And he understood all of that, knowing that he would go to the cross. Do you understand what that means? It means that he understood scientifically all the pain that he was going to feel before he got there, and he still gave us the ability to feel pain even though he was going to suffer through it himself. Pain is a gift because pain shows us something is wrong. But here's what Jesus does. Jesus makes suffering and pain temporary and redemptive. The pain won't be forever. The sickness won't be forever. The diagnosis won't be forever. The broken relationships won't be forever. Jesus says that there's a time coming when all of that will go away and we won't have to deal with it anymore. And that we can even leverage those things into good things in our life if we're willing to. Over the years, I've coached a ton. I've talked about this before, but the kids that get it the best are the kids that when you say you've got to run 2 laps, they don't go, ugh, right? And they just start to run like they're dragging their feet across the field. It's the kids that go, okay, and then here's what they do. They finish their laps, and then you know what they do? They go back and they run with the other kids that aren't done yet. Because they get it. And they recognize it's not about just getting through it. It's not about just doing it. It's about doing it to get stronger and to engage with it. And then they go get other kids and they go, I'm going to bring you with me. Listen, if we have the hope of Jesus, the idea is this. That when suffering and pain come into our lives, which we cannot escape, it is not something that we can just get away from. We all know this, no matter how hard we try. When we lean in and we say, God, what are you going to do through this? What is the thing that you're working on in me? How are you going to use it to introduce other people to you or to build your kingdom? And then as we walk through it, we grab somebody else and we go, you're coming with me. Especially if it's something like you've had the diagnosis and you've gotten through it, now somebody else has the diagnosis. You've had the problem with your kids and then you see somebody else have the problem with their kids, and so you grab them and you say, I'll walk with you through it. We go get other people, we say, we're not going to just see this pain, because this is what Jesus did for us. When we go through pain, we look at Jesus and we go, he suffered too. He went through the pain as well. And what did he do? He grabs us by the hand and goes, I'm coming with you. You're not on your own. I'll come too. This is how we lean in. Now, wrapping this up. Here's what I also know. I don't just want it today to be the rah-rah, Pastor Corey can talk like a coach for a while and make it all seem good, and then when we get home and suffering really happens, it's tough. I get it. I am not discrediting any of real pain, real sorrow, real frustration, real evil. And there are real situations that are very, very difficult, and I am not discrediting it. That is true. And sometimes you just need a good cry, right? Sometimes you need to sit in it for a little bit. Like Scripture talks about sackcloth and ashes. I don't know if that's what you need to do, but like we need to like sit for a while and just like wallow in it. I've heard people say, I'm going to give myself 24 hours and I'm going to pick myself up out of this, right? Sometimes you just have to grieve it. That's real and that's true. I don't want to discredit the fact that this is real, and there are different people in this room or watching online, whatever, that are going through this and going through very difficult things. The question for you is, how are you going to lean into it? How are you going to ask God to use it? So this is the last question, right? What's hard in life right now? What's hard? It could be something that's really, really hard. It could be something that's kind of difficult. What is it? Have you talked to God about it yet? Have you talked to Jesus, the God, the God who suffered alongside? Like, have you had that conversation yet? And then I would say this. Ask God to do something with your pain. Pain and suffering are only worthless when we do nothing with it. When we think it's worthless, when we think it's an obstacle to get around, when it's something that we just don't want anything to do with. But just like in every other situation, if we lean in and we say, God, I want you to do something through this in me, he will. And you'll see on the other side something that he did that only he could do. I don't have all the answers, right? Why does God allow bad things to happen? I don't know all the time. And sometimes we'll get that question answered here. Sometimes we'll see and we'll go, man, I went through that really difficult time. And then 3 years later, we go, that's why, right? God did this, and I'm so glad he did. And some things we'll go through the rest of our lives and go, I don't know why that happened. But God let it happen. I'm not sure why. But I do know it's not worthless. And I do know that Jesus didn't see suffering as something that wasn't worth it. He suffers right alongside us. And so when we walk through it, we are not on our own. We can lean into him. And he will do something through our pain and suffering that only he can do. If you're struggling with something, I would encourage you engage with other people, pray together. Don't go through it by yourself. Don't just sweep it under the rug and go, no one cares. No. Like, let's be people that go back to the people that are still running and grab them by the hand and say, I'll go with you. I'll keep going with you. Don't do it by yourself. Lean in and ask God to do something only he can do with the struggles that you see in your life.